Well, it happened. Despite many of his supporters saying he wasn't going to actually do it, he was just playing hardball, it was just posturing, President Donald Trump's massive tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China that were announced last month have officially gone into effect. And so for Canada and Mexico, that means a sweeping 25% tariff on many goods, while China got slapped with an additional 10% on top of similar tariffs imposed a month ago. Now with that, this isn't a one-way street. China wasted no time responding, and they slapped the US with retaliatory tariffs, took measures against multiple US companies, and filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization. And that WTO lawsuit is actually the second one that China has submitted, with the first one being back in February when the US initially imposed an additional 10% tariff on Chinese goods. Though really, those complaints, they're not going to go anywhere, and that's because disputes at the organization rely on a 3-judge panel that needs US approval. And that's before even mentioning that multiple Republicans and Donald Trump have made it clear that they are open to leaving NATO, the UN, and other world organizations. So if the WTO actually didn't side with the US, I wouldn't be shocked if we just pulled out. Also, as far as American companies go, China has added a bunch to its export control list, meaning that they won't get access to certain Chinese goods no matter what. And notably there, American farmers are possibly the group that will feel these tariffs the most because it's their products being affected, which is a very big deal because China is actually the biggest market for American agricultural exports. Now to be clear, this doesn't mean that American farmers will spend more to send goods to China, just like it doesn't cost Chinese companies more to sell goods to Americans. But it does mean that Chinese buyers will have to spend more on American agricultural products, disincentivizing them from buying products that already operate on razor-thin margins. I mean, even calling it razor-thin, that's generous considering that many rely on US government subsidies to even exist. But with that, you do have Trump saying on social media that he has a plan. With him writing on Truth Social to the great farmers of the United States, get ready to start making a lot of agricultural products to be sold inside of the United States. Tariffs will go on external products April 2nd. Have fun. However, that ended up causing a mini panic online, with many thinking that Trump was trying to say that he was going to tax American farmers who were trying to send their products abroad. Or that would essentially be an export duty, which is unconstitutional, as many pointed out. And at the same time, his post could be read as imposing a tariff on agricultural products from outside of the United States, leading to some confusion. Right, and all of this as the retaliation from Canada was similar. Right, so Canadians wanting to import many American goods will need to pay a 25% tariff, with more items being added in 21 days. And Canadians might really feel the pain, with Immigration Minister Mark Miller warning that up to 1 million Canadian jobs were at risk, and adding, "We can't replace an economy that is responsible for 80% of our trade overnight, and it's going to hurt." With one of the industries that'll likely get slammed by these tariffs being the automobile industry. Right, and that because much of its production spans the US, Canada, and Mexico. With seeing, for example, the BBC having a great outline of just one part: pistons. Right, with that, aluminum is sent from Tennessee to Pennsylvania to be turned into rods. And from there, it goes to Canada to be shaped and polished, which means an additional 25% on the cost. It then goes to Mexico to be turned into pistons, and from there, it goes to Michigan to be added to an engine. But before that, the American importer needs to pay Uncle Sam another 25% tariff. Also, speaking of Mexico, as I'm recording this, they just said that they expect to respond on Sunday. And all of this as the response to the tariffs have been wide-ranging. Right, I mean, one of the things we saw is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau giving a somber speech this morning.
I want to speak first directly to the American people. We don't want this. We want to work with you as a friend and ally. And we don't want to see you hurt either. But your government has chosen to do this to you. As of this morning, markets are down, and inflation is set to rise dramatically.
And he's right about the markets. Leading up to the tariffs, essentially all of them have been falling. The Dow is down nearly 3% over the past 5 days. The NASDAQ is pushing 5%. The S&P 500 is hovering around 3%. And Canadian stock exchanges are similarly feeling the news. But then also, going back to Trudeau, we saw him go on to say,
they've chosen to launch a trade war that will, first and foremost, harm American families. They've chosen to sabotage their own agenda that was supposed to usher in a new golden age for the United States.
And one of the things that Trudeau was particularly upset about was that Trump had justified the tariffs as a response to Canada not doing enough to stop fentanyl from being smuggled across the border. But as Trudeau pointed out, and as we have reported in the past, less than 1% of fentanyl actually comes across the Canadian border. But really, none of that matters, as the goalpost has now been moved, with Trump also claiming that Canadian banking laws are not fair and writing this morning, Canada doesn't allow American banks to do business in Canada, but their banks flood the American market. Oh, that seems fair to me, doesn't it? To which Trudeau actually said,
I heard he talked about banking again this morning in a tweet, which doesn't make any sense because American banks, there's about 16 American banks currently active in Canada holding about $113 billion worth of assets in this country. So the American banks are alive and well and prospering in Canada. It's an example of not really being able to see what it is that he wants. What he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us.
Now, granted, Canadian regulations for banks are pretty strict, but their law does allow American banks to even operate on the retail side of things. And, the list of American banks currently operating in Canada includes some of our biggest, like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, US Bank, JP Morgan, and Northern Trust. And in total, American banks actually account for half of all assets held by foreign banks in Canada. We also saw after this Trudeau going on to stress that Canada will never be the 51st state, while also conceding that, yes, the US can certainly hurt the Canadian economy. Trudeau, seemingly, like many, also confused about the change in US foreign policy.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Now I want to speak directly to one specific American, Donald. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do. We two friends fighting is exactly what our opponents around the world want to see.
Which, if you didn't see the very right-wing Wall Street Journal op-ed board, they put out a piece called "Trump Takes the Dumbest Tariff Plunge," with them then going on to say, "We courted Mr. Trump's ire by calling the Mexico and Canada levies the dumbest in history, and we may have understated the point. Mr. Trump is whacking friends, not adversaries. His taxes will hit every cross-border transaction, and the North American vehicle market is so interconnected that some cars cross a border as many as 8 times as they're assembled." Also, I'll say, in addition to Trudeau, elsewhere in Canada, we've seen local leaders pushing for a harsher response. Like, for example, you had the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, wanting to cut off energy to the United States and is encouraging all the provinces to do the same. And on top of that, he wants to block exports of key materials like uranium and potash. I mean, even in the United States, we've seen a lukewarm response to the tariffs, with, for example, Republicans like Rand Paul tweeting out, "US tariffs inevitably bring Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese tariffs, which means higher prices for lumber, steel, aluminum, and more expensive homes and cars." And adding, retaliatory tariffs lead to lowered US farm exports, lowered bourbon exports, and less international shipping. Tariffs are taxes, and if you tax trade, you'll get less trade and less prosperity. But with all that said, you have some claiming that we're already seeing the tariffs be successful. Right in that, because you have companies like Apple announcing plans to spend $500 billion within the US over the next few years. With that money said to be split between expanding manufacturing as well as training new hires and projects like Apple TV productions. Then you also have Oracle, OpenAI, and SoftBank all announcing that they were spending $500 billion on a new company called Stargate that would focus on AI infrastructure across the US. So the latest so-called win for those who support tariffs is TSMC. Right in there, the Taiwanese chip manufacturer that essentially all advanced computing relies on. And yesterday, they announced they wanted to spend $100 billion to grow its US manufacturing operations. A move that'll expand their American manufacturing to 4 fabrication plants in total that will range from manufacturing chips to assemblies that combine components into advanced systems. With Trump praising the move, saying,
"This is a tremendous move by the most powerful company in the world. It's a matter of economic security. It's also a matter of national security for us."
With them also saying that would help TSMC spread their manufacturing out from just Taiwan, where it's arguably vulnerable to a Chinese attack. And this, as TSMC's chairman and CEO predicted that these expansions would mean that 40% of the global chip market comes from the US, though I will say such a goal is considered ambitious. However, it should also be noted that TSMC is generally reluctant to open manufacturing centers that produce their most state-of-the-art components outside of Taiwan. News like this has caused some people online to praise the Trump tariffs, saying things like, to all the people saying tariffs don't work, here is TSMC saying they are going to invest $100 billion in the US, build 5 new facilities, and create 20,000 American jobs. Probably just a coincidence. Although to attribute 100% of this situation to tariffs, that's disingenuous. The Biden administration had worked hard to give companies like TSMC huge grants to expand their US operations. But all of that said, as far as the big picture here, it is widely expected that the net results of the tariffs, it's going to mean that economies across the world are going to take a hit and prices are going to skyrocket. Though honestly, we're going to have to wait to see how all this plays out, both in the kind of grander scope, the more generalized scope, and with more of the specifics. Specifics like with each country, including, we need to wait to hear from Mexico on Sunday, as well as general updates and general tariffs. With, for example, starting next week, we're supposed to see tariffs on all aluminum and steel, regardless of where they come from. And then in April, that's supposed to be on agricultural products and foreign cars, regardless of their origin. We'll cross those bridges when we get there. And in the meantime, I gotta ask you, what are your thoughts here? Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this clip from the full Philip DeFranco show. And also, a big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring our Clips channel. Turn your passion into profit over at squarespace.com/Phil, or use the QR code. Because whether you're launching a business or a lucrative side hustle, your website is your digital business card. It's the only space where you control the story, no algorithms or distractions. And with Squarespace, it's so easy because they got a ton of stunning professional templates with drag and drop editing that makes site design incredibly simple. No coding required. So get started for free at squarespace.com/Phil, or scan the QR code on screen and use code Phil for 10% off when ready to launch. Squarespace.com/Phil.